In this video, we will talk about the mechanisms of natural selection and how natural selection works. Before we get into the details, let's give some definitions. Natural selection is individuals who are best able to survive and reproduce will pass on more offspring to the next generation, resulting in evolution. In the last video, we defined evolution as descent with modification. For the purposes of understanding natural selection, we're going to now define evolution as a change in population over time. And a population is a group of individuals of the same species who are interacting with one another. Variation in terms of evolution and natural selection refers to the fact that there are multiple versions of particular traits, so not everyone looks identical. An adaptation is a characteristic of an organism that enhances survival and reproduction in particular environments. And fitness is the relative number of offspring compared to other individuals in the population that an individual can have. So an organism with higher fitness is just an organism who has more offspring. So according to Darwin, natural selection requires that three principles must be in place. First, the population in question where natural selection is occurring must have variation. That means the organisms don't all look the same, they don't all have the same behavior, they're not all the same size or the same color. So if we were going to look at this figure over here, this part right here demonstrates that there's variation among the size and color of the beetles in this image. Secondly, that variation that we just talked about must have some genetic or heritable basis. That means that these traits, these variable traits, need to be passed on to their offspring. If we look at this image right here, what's illustrated is that there are different genes associated with the different size and color of beetles. So that's all that's demonstrating. So if the genes are what's determining the size and the color of the beetles, then that means that the genes will be passed down to the offspring and that the traits are heritable. The third principle of natural selection is that there must be selection on that variation. Therefore, some individuals have an adaptive advantage over others in the population, and they will survive and have more offspring. So in this case, the selection on the beetles of different colors is that a predator can see the ones who are not camouflaged, and the predator eats the ones that are very obvious. So in this case, the brown beetles do better. They're more able to survive, and therefore they're more likely to reproduce, while the green ones are going to be eaten at a higher rate. So what that results in is that the next generation will look different or have a different genetic makeup from the original population. Here's the original population down here, where there's sort of equal numbers of green and brown beetles. Some of the green ones get eaten at a higher rate than the brown ones do, and so the resulting population looks different from the original population. There are a lot more brown beetles that survived and reproduced than green beetles. So that change over time in the population is evolution, and what we just described is evolution by the process of natural selection with these three principles. Variation, the variation having a heritable basis, and selection on that same variation so that some individuals have more offspring than others. There are some very important things to remember about natural selection. One thing is that individuals do not evolve. Individuals cannot get an adaptation. What happens is there's variation in the population. Some individuals survive and some individuals don't survive. So it's the populations that can evolve, not individuals. When natural selection acts on an individual, it basically means that individual doesn't survive to reproduce. Or it does. That is it. Also, natural selection requires the existing variation that we talked about. It cannot act on a population in which individuals are all identical. If in that population that we were just looking at with the beetles, all of them were the same size and the same color, we wouldn't have natural selection acting on them on the basis of color. Every individual would have the same adaptive advantage. Also, environments vary, and because of that, traits in one environment may not be well adapted for another environment. Also, environments can change over time, so at one point in time, a particular trait might be adaptive, but over time, if the environment changed, that trait that was adaptive in the past may actually be maladaptive in the future and may actually decrease fitness of the organism. So adaptations are specific to time and place. So I don't know if you've heard of artificial selection, but artificial selection is very similar to natural selection, and it still requires the three principles that we just talked about. But artificial selection is different from natural selection because it is completely focused on human-based selection. Artificial selection is the selective breeding of organisms by humans to produce domesticated animals or plants with more desirable traits. So every domesticated animal, cows, sheep, cats, dogs, horses, all of these are the product of artificial selection. Humans choosing which traits they prefer and therefore changing what would have been occurring in nature to something that better suits the needs of the humans. One great example of artificial selection is in the wild mustard. This is what this plant looks like in nature. Okay, this plant, this species, is the original species. It's actually the same species that is used for all of these different products that we get at the grocery store, depending on what the prior generations have been selected for. So over decades or hundreds of years, or maybe even longer, humans have selected from this plant different traits that it wanted to emphasize. So kale is a wild mustard plant that its ancestors have been selected for larger leaves. So that's where we get the kale. In plants that have been selected for generations for the axillary buds, that's where we get Brussels sprouts. Cabbage is the wild mustard plant that over time has been selected for the apical bud. This is the apical bud of this wild mustard plant, having been selected over hundreds of generations or thousands of generations. Broccoli has been is from plants, wild mustard plants, where humans have selected for flowers and stems, and kohlrabi is another version of the wild mustard plant that's been selected for stems. So all of these different products come from artificial selection from this wild plant. That tells you that there's some natural variation in the plant and that it is very flexible, allowing humans to select for different traits, and given enough time can result in all of these different products from a single plant. In part 2 of chapter 22, we will discuss the scientific evidence that supports our understanding of macroevolution and microevolution, and we'll also distinguish between those two terms.